The information provided in this podcast episode is for entertainment purposes and is not medical advice. If you have any questions about your health, contact a medical professional. This content is strictly the opinions of Lucas Aoun and is for informational and entertainment purposes only. The references, claims, and scientific information linked to any products are only applicable to those listeners who are based in the US. If you are outside the US, this information does not apply to you. It is not intended to provide medical advice or to take the place of medical advice or treatment from a personal physician. All viewers of this content are advised to consult with their doctors or qualified health professionals regarding specific health questions. Thank you for listening to the Boost Your Biology podcast. My name is Lucas Aoun. I uncover the most cutting-edge health information on the planet, ranging from hormones, nutrition, supplementation, fat loss, biohacking, longevity, wellness, and a whole lot more. Welcome to the Boost Your Biology podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Boost Your Biology podcast. Today's special guest will be exploring all things gut health, and specifically we're going to be focused on butyrate, which is a phenomenal short-chain fatty acid. So joining me on the show, we have Justine Stenger. Justine, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. So maybe, Justine, do you want to let my audience know a little bit about your health journey and how you became so fascinated with optimizing human health?
Yeah, of course. I played a very high level of athletics, basically ever since I was about 8 years old, and played university basketball. And I ended up completely losing my reserve capacity when I was in my early 20s and really started to experience pretty ill health that lasted for a good duration of time. I wasn't really sure where to go for answers. And so I just really started to get curious and did a lot of investigating on my own. And through that, got connected with an amazing physician out of Calgary. His name is Dr. Bruce Hoffman, who practices integrative medicine. And it was really my work with him. I started working with his patients and seeing labs change. He actually implemented something called lipid replacement therapy. I don't know if you're familiar with that, using phospholipids and fatty acids to really help to restore mitochondrial functioning and the cellular health in general. And that's what led me to study phospholipids and fatty acids. And I became absolutely fascinated and really obsessed with understanding the cell membrane and the roles that phospholipids play in our health. And along the way, butyrate is such a powerful tool it's a 4-carbon chain fatty acid, which we're going to talk about today. And so along the way, I started to learn about butyrate and all the different roles that it plays in the body. And it was really, my personal experience and then experience with patients that really made me understand that it's all about the mitochondria. It's all about cellular health. And so if we can help people understand what we need to restore the structure and the integrity of our cell membranes, and then we can use these really targeted approaches to help give people a leg up in their health, that I just believe that the most incredible healing is possible. And I see it on a regular basis. So that's my story. That's how I got here today. And now all I teach is phospholipids, fatty acids, cell membrane medicine, and I absolutely love it.
That's awesome. And so back then, Justine, did they have any butyrate supplements on the market, or was most of the research focused on increasing butyrate production endogenously?
There was sodium butyrate. Actually, the company BodyBio is the company that Bruce Hoffman used clinically. And so they made butyrate. I don't know how many years it's been now that they made sodium butyrate, but as long as I've been familiar with BodyBio, they've made sodium butyrate. So the interesting thing about, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but the interesting thing about our own production versus, supplementing with butyrate is that a lot of these studies that I've read are actually using supraphysiological doses. So we would need to take supplements to really attain those levels. Not to say that it's not really important for our commensal bacteria to be making healthy amounts of butyrate as well. But I do think that there's a really beautiful role that supplemental butyrate plays when it comes to not only our gut health. I know that's a focus today, but butyrate really has head to toe benefits.
Absolutely. Well, definitely, we're going to get into those further details with supplementation and things like that. But maybe we'll sort of dial it down a little bit for my audience so that they can just get a rough idea, like what actually is butyrate. Like it's oftentimes discussed in the wellness space. I would say it's quite trendy at the moment. There's a lot of practitioners talking about it. So do you want to sort of just explain what is butyrate?
Yeah, for sure. So butyrate is a 4 carbon chain fatty acid. So it's typically believed that it's made through the fermentation of dietary fiber, and that is one way that we do make butyrate. Butyrate is one of about 8 different short chain fatty acids that are made in the human body, and we have 3 main ones. So we have butyrate, acetate, and propionate. And butyrate is actually made in the lowest concentrations of those 3, but it is the most significant when it comes to our gut health, because of the role that it plays in feeding the colonocytes and helping to support pathogenic intestinal permeability or leaky gut, its role in inflammation. It really acts as an anti-inflammatory and antioxidant. So it has many, many roles. But that's butyrate. So if you think about a carbon chain, it's 4 carbon chains long. I don't know how well versed your audience is in biochemistry, but that's why it's called a short chain fatty acid versus a longer chain fatty acid that would have more carbon chains.
Yeah. And so in terms of the like initial research, Justine, was it centered around its specifically its benefits for gut health, or were they studying it for other aspects of health?
I became most familiar with butyrate around the benefits for gut health initially. I think it's more and more research is coming out all the time, Lucas, around butyrate for brain health and cardiovascular health and kidney health and mitochondrial support. But the initial research that I read was all about gut. And that was really what everyone was talking about. Butyrate helps to support gut health. And I'll go so far to say now that I think it's the number one tool for supporting gut health, because when you look at the literature, there's nothing that's more powerful than butyrate because of the role that it plays in helping to support tight junction integrity. So it actually has that characteristic where it can really pull those tight junctions back together. And through that, we see all kinds of benefits. Like we see the prevention of LPS translocation from the gut to the liver through that portal vein. We see really systemic benefits from butyrate because of the role that it plays in helping to support the gut. So that was my kind of introduction to butyrate just around gut health. And of course, then I really thought that the only way for us to make butyrate was to eat fiber. So we had to eat lots of fiber so that we could ferment the fiber, our commensal bacteria, and make these short chain fatty acids. But now my horizon has really widened, and I know that there's many other ways that we can make butyrate as well, which we'll talk about. But yes, it was originally all about the gut.
Yeah. In terms of a couple of ways to stimulate butyrate production, so like from a dietary perspective, maybe let's sort of explore some of those approaches to actually supercharge the gut with butyrate.
So, do you want me to go into the kind of old school belief about butyrate, or do you want me to talk about the newer? Okay, so first of all, butyrate has always been known to be made through the fermentation of dietary fiber. So, fiber plus fermentation equals butyrate, and butyrate is often referred to as a postbiotic. So, when we think about, any foods that contain fiber, but it was resistant starch was really studied. So any of those foods that are higher in resistant starch, so beans and legumes and some of the grains. And then there were quite a few studies that actually showed that when you cooked and cooled some of these products, then the resistant starch content actually increased in some of these foods. So then there was this whole, kind of era of people that were, or groups of people that were cooking and cooling rice or cooking and cooling legumes, and then that was going to increase the resistant starch content and believed to improve butyrate production through those commensal bacteria. So that's typically how we were taught that we make butyrate. And of course, that is a mechanism. And through my research, I've found now that we also make butyrate through the beta oxidation of fatty acids. And we also, interestingly enough, make butyrate through light frequencies, specifically through the activation of POMC, which is a gene encoding protein that cleaves into about 6 to 8 different peptides. And that is activated by light, UV light specifically. And that's the role that that plays is specifically through alpha MSH. So now I think that it's really fascinating. And I've really, went down this whole rabbit hole and how we are so regulated by light. It's unbelievable. And so I think that's probably the most significant modulator of gut health, actually, is, intimately connected to circadian biology and making sure that we're getting adequate amounts of sunlight and sunlight at the right times of the day, and avoiding any forms of artificial light at the wrong times of the day, specifically at night. And so those are kind of the three ways that I know of now that we can make these short chain fatty acids.
Interesting. So obviously, I mean, the light exposure is a fairly new aspect that I haven't really considered in terms of ways to, support gut health. With Butyrate itself, Justine, if we were to look closely at the effects on the microbiome, like what sort of impact is it having in some of the clinical studies in terms of potentially addressing or supporting potentially like IBS, potentially intestinal hyperpermeability? So what can you sort of say on that front?
Yeah, so many ways, Lucas. So butyrate, I'd mentioned, so butyrate's the number one fuel for our colonocytes. So really important for us to have healthy levels of butyrate so that we're feeding those cells. And then we also look at butyrate as an antioxidant. So it's helping to improve the environment in the gut through lowering inflammation and helping to suppress some really potent inflammatory pathways. It also has been shown to help support our own commensal bacteria's ability to make these short chain fatty acids. It's an antifungal, which is something that a lot of even the practitioners that I speak to about butyrate, a lot of practitioners don't even know about that quality. So it's really a powerful tool that we can use for things like yeast overgrowth, candida, et cetera. And we're supporting the individual. I always really look for ways that we can support people instead of depleting them, especially when people are sick, because the whole point is we need to rebuild reserve capacity, not lower it. And so it's through a lot of those, and then it's improving pathogenic intestinal permeability by allowing those tight junctions to heal and seal back together. And so through all those mechanisms, we're supporting a really healthy gut. It's also a histone deacetylase inhibitor, Lucas. So it was originally studied, and almost all the studies that I read probably 5 or 7 years ago were around it being very protective against colorectal cancer. But now we know that it's actually protective against all, or supports the protection, I should say, against all forms of cancer because of that histone deacetylase inhibition activity. And it's helping to modulate our gene expression. So many ways and reasons to use butyrate. And that's where I really think that supplementation can be a powerful tool. Because again, in a lot of the studies that I've read, and not all of them, there are studies also that are done with just, healthy levels of butyrate in human beings and how that's also protective against all of these, or supports the protection of all these different cancers and cardiovascular disease and neuroinflammatory diseases that lead to neurodegenerative diseases. So there's lots of benefits. Obviously, we all want to have a healthy gut, right? That's critically important. But I do think that there's some really specific advantages that we can glean from using butyrate supplementation as well.
Yeah, you mentioned a pretty fascinating pathway, which I believe I covered on a YouTube video many, many months ago, which is that the HDAC inhibition. From memory, I was looking into ways to banish fear, or ways to there's a pathway called HDAC inhibitors for promoting fear extinction. And they were looking at how HDAC inhibitors can actually, at least in these animal studies, remove the likelihood of them experiencing fear, which is pretty cool.
Oh, Interesting. That is really, really interesting. I don't know if you want me to share. I don't know if your audience knows, what histone deacetylase inhibition is. But it's really just the acetylation and deacetylation of histones, and this is going to influence the chromatome structure and ultimately gene expression. So our DNA are actually tightly wrapped around these histones. So if anybody is wondering what that big word means, that's all it is.
What about in terms of, Justine, if we sort of explore how butyrate, if we're looking at it from a supplemental perspective, and we'll get into details around the dosages and timing and how to use it, how best to utilize it. But before we do that, what do you think butyrate would stack well with from like a supplemental perspective? Like, are there other synergistic nutrients you've seen work really well clinically?
Yeah, actually, I love this question so much because I actually don't even recommend people take butyrate unless they're taking phospholipids and fatty acids, really supporting their phospholipid and fatty acid levels. So I mentioned before, my area of expertise is in cell membrane medicine and phospholipids and fatty acids and mitochondrial medicine. And so we can use lipids or lipid replacement therapy to go in and restore damaged aspects to the cell membrane, to the mitochondrial membrane, and replace those damaged aspects of the membrane with these really healthy, fresh, functional phospholipids. And that's one of the main reasons why I love the BodyBio PC. That's a product that I would say everybody on the planet should be taking, just because the role that it plays in helping to support our cells and our mitochondria. And so butyrate pairs really well with the BodyBio phospholipid complex, the essential fatty acid blend, the balance oil, which is a combination of those two essential fatty acids that are supporting not the fluidity of the cell membrane and so many aspects of our health, because those fatty acids can't be made in the body. We don't have the enzymes to synthesize them. And then I often will pair sodium butyrate. So then I'll bring sodium butyrate on board and pair that also with TUDCA, which is a bile salt. I don't know if you're familiar with TUDCA. And that's because they work really beautifully synergistically together. And they also both have chaperone activity. And so a chaperone is just a molecule or a protein that has the ability to help support protein folding. And also has the ability to go in and break down misfolded proteins or misfolded lipids that are, causing damage on a cellular level. So those four are probably my top four, recommendations for most people, just because the role that they play in keeping our cells healthy. And then, of course, you have all the other benefits to butyrate, where it's been shown to be supportive to the mitochondria. We can convert those 4 carbon chain fatty acids into acetyl-CoA and use them as a source of energy. And then I don't know if you want me to get it. I know this is focused on gut, so I don't know if you want me to get into all the brain benefits, but there are so many brain benefits when it comes to sodium butyrate and then TUDCA. It kind of pairing those two together really create kind of this, brain on steroids scenario. So those are really, really supportive.
Yeah, my audience is very much familiar with TUDCA because I think I've brainwashed them now with all the benefits associated with with that compound. I've been using it probably for the past 2.5 to 3 years, almost every single day. Obviously, I cycle it, but yeah, I learned about TUDCA in terms of its amazing hepatoprotective qualities, and I do recommend it quite a lot to a number of clients as well. So it's definitely a super powerful bile acid, alongside even some of the other bile acids as well. But let's definitely dive deeper into some of the impressive research around how butyrate can affect the brain, specifically its neuroprotective qualities. Let's sort of underpin some of those mechanisms.
Yeah, I would love to. And yes, to all things TEDCA. I think that the one thing I feel so many people don't acknowledge when it comes to TEDCA is that it is reducing the stress on the endoplasmic reticulum. It is literally supporting protein folding. And so as we age, what an amazing opportunity we have to support protein folding by, taking this bile acid, secondary bile salt. So butyrate, just like the gut, we have a blood-brain barrier that is made of the same material. So butyrate's been shown to support the integrity of the blood-brain barrier. And I'm sure that everybody is familiar with, what happens when we have a breached blood-brain barrier and we get things in the brain that shouldn't be in the brain because the brain's immune system is so very different than the rest of the body. And so when we get those immune cells in the brain activated, those microglial cells activated, they get primed, they release these inflammatory cytokines, and they don't turn off, like we can dampen the immune system in the rest of the body. And so we can actually use butyrate to support converting those primed or activated microglial cells. So there's different stages. So M1 would be primed, activated, they're releasing these inflammatory cytokines. The brain is on fire. And of course, that if we don't get that under control, that's going to lead to neurodegenerative disease long term. That butyrate actually has the ability to transition those cells from an M1 back to an M2, which is kind of that regenerative state, and then all the way back to M0, which is where we want them. That's their even keel state, where they're just kind of surveying what's going on in the brain. And so that in itself, I think, is enough for anybody that has had a concussion, anyone that has brain fog, vertigo, trouble concentrating, memory, focus, all these symptoms that we know are associated with neuroinflammation, to definitely consider, using butyrate as a supportive tool. And then I talked about that chaperone activity that it has as well. So there's actually quite a few clients that I've worked with that have been diagnosed with a neurodegenerative disease, that their neurologist has actually put them on sodium butyrate and TEDCA to support, because of the chaperone activity as well. Because we know that when we think about tau proteins or beta amyloid plaque, these are aggregations of these misfolded proteins. And we can use TEDCA and sodium butyrate to help support going in and breaking those down, while also simultaneously preventing the misfolding of those proteins as well. So, and then just from an antioxidant and anti-inflammatory perspective, sodium butyrate also can get converted directly in the neurons into beta hydroxybutyrate and be used as a fuel source. So many reasons to use. I always say that the benefits of butyrate are, because so many people again think that it's just in the gut. It's the benefits of butyrate are head to toe benefits.
Yeah, and in terms of that last aspect there that you mentioned was the impact of it increasing, that beta hydroxybutyrate, which is BHB, which I know a number of supplements are on the market now, like as exogenous BHB salts to promote that, to mimic being in ketosis. So I'd imagine, could potentially someone benefit from butyrate when they take it first thing in the morning and they take it fasted? Potentially, I doubt it would break the fast, right? Because it's not really a carbohydrate.
Yeah, it's specific. Well, I wouldn't say. I mean, there's different beliefs around what breaks a fast. I've read quite a few studies showing that it's kind of above and beyond about 50 calories. So you would need 2 capsules is, I think, 15 calories in the sodium butyrate. So you'd need to take more than 6 to break the fast. But that kind of aside, the sodium butyrate doesn't get converted to beta hydroxybutyrate in the periphery like it does in the neuron. So that's specific to the neurons have the ability to convert it.
Yeah, so that would mean if somebody were to do a ketones assessment prick, they wouldn't see a bump in their ketone levels in their blood, right? It's just more so, you're saying, in the neurons in the brain.
Yeah, you might a tiny bit. There might be a small increase, but it's not going to be. It's not like taking these ketone little drinks, like exogenous ketones, that are really going to help to elevate ketone bodies. It's different.
Okay, in terms of, this is an important discussion around the different forms of butyrate. So obviously the main focus has been on sodium butyrate, different supplements, and obviously for those listening in, if they do want to actually check out BodyBio's butyrate, I will leave that linked in the podcast show notes. That will be linked down below in the podcast show notes. But in terms of the different types of butyrate, Justine, do you want to sort of explain, we've got sodium butyrate, calcium butyrate, magnesium butyrate. So do you want to sort of break down what is the difference between those different types?
Yeah, so all it is so the butyric acid is attached to a mineral salt, and the different forms of butyrate the butyric acid is just attached to a different mineral salt. So in the sodium butyrate, there's 3 butyric acids that are attached to a sodium backbone. And then in the CalMag, it's calcium and magnesium. So those, it is CalMag and are together in the body bioformula anyway. Now, most of the research that I've read is actually done on sodium butyrate, and sodium butyrate is the true biological substrate. So that's what we make through the fermentation of dietary fiber, also through beta oxidation of fatty acids, and through this light pathway that I spoke about. So I personally am very partisan to the sodium butyrate, just because I have read probably 500 studies on butyrate, and 90 or 95% of them are on sodium butyrate. Now, that doesn't mean that CalMag isn't beneficial, and there are quite a few studies specifically on CalMag for IBD. And I would say that these IBD studies, CalMag butyrate is actually used more often in those studies than sodium butyrate. So it could just be a factor of they haven't done as many studies on CalMag butyrate as they have on sodium, because really it's just, the difference is the mineral salt. But I personally try to mimic what our body makes as much as possible. So if sodium is available, that's the one that I select and I recommend to my clients. But that's the only difference. And then the tributrin, that other form of butyrate would be the butyric acid is actually attached to a glycerol backbone. So that's the only difference between kind of those 3 options.
In terms of perhaps, I know we're sort of jumping gears, but I guess in the picture of like metabolic health, obviously, enforcing or tightening up those tight junctions is important for many different aspects. But what about in terms of like supporting insulin sensitivity? Have there been any studies around that? And maybe do you want to sort of explain to my audience the way that you believe that insulin resistance actually occurs in the first place?
That's a loaded question, because my thoughts on that have changed a lot over the last year. So I'll first talk about the mechanism. So butyrate helps to support blood glucose regulation and helps to improve the insulin receptor. So it makes the insulin receptor more sensitive. But there's also evidence showing that it supports the pancreatic beta cells. And I don't know if that's through, its anti-inflammatory properties or really what the mechanism there is, but there are studies showing that it does help to support the pancreatic beta cells and then improve the insulin receptor and also support blood glucose regulation. So those are all, so valuable for people today, because we really do have this epidemic of diabetes and insulin resistance, which leptin resistance obviously is going to start to be a precursor to all of that. And I do think diet plays a role for sure. I'm a big believer and teach this with all my clients, that the timing of when we eat is just as important as what we eat. And so I do think that we have a really, really chaotic, distorted schedule around eating now. A lot of people are skipping breakfast because of this whole intermittent fasting craze, and they are kind of eating later in the day. And we just know as human beings, we have more insulin resistance and more inability to regulate blood sugar levels as the day goes on. So I think in some cases, we're probably driving these conditions just through, attempting to alleviate them, just because we should be loading that food in the first part of the day. And if anybody is doing intermittent fasting, which is a great addition to, anyone's regime who's healthy, has blood sugar regulation, that we should be skipping dinner, not breakfast. So, but the thing is, Lucas, is the more and more that I study quantum biology and understand the impact of light on our system, you do see, and I've read dozens of studies now that show that just being on a computer or cell phone, being under LED lights, blue light will directly raise blood sugar levels and cause insulin resistance. And it also is going to be impacting leptin, because leptin, that master hormone that regulates energy in the body, is a hormone of light. And so the way that we are living outside of how we are eating is directly linked to the problems that we see with diabetes, insulin resistance, and blood sugar instability.
Yeah, that's an important subject, because we don't really focus on that, but that is it's sort of like chronobiology and sort of looking at the impact of, light exposure, artificial light. I mean, what you mentioned there, Justine, around the fact that, artificial fluorescent light bulbs that are in office buildings and things like that directly increase cortisol, adrenaline, the sympathetic nervous system. They can, promote inflammation indirectly in that regard. Then, as you and I know, that cortisol is that glucocorticoid, so it's going to spike your blood sugar levels, lead to like issues regulating appetite, and then probably downstream affecting leptin, ghrelin, insulin. What you mentioned before around like the fasting aspect, or I guess like minimizing like big meals and big amounts of food volume late in the evening. Did you want to have you sort of looked at this sort of like early time restricted feeding sort of studies on that in that area?
Yeah. Yeah. I intuitively, that never felt, listening to that advice never felt right, to delay eating, just because I, fortunately was familiar with leptin and knowing that leptin a little bit. I'm much more familiar with leptin now than I was, a year ago. But leptin, we need fat and protein to signal to leptin. And so without that signal in the morning, specifically, I mean, what I teach my clients is to get outside and watch the sunrise and get as much as that of that UVA light as possible. And then we want to pair our biggest meal of the day with that morning light exposure. And that really sets the stage for, energy regulation over the course of the day, for optimizing insulin sensitivity, optimizing our ability to regulate blood glucose levels and appetite, right? Because now you've signaled to leptin. Your leptin can communicate with the brain to communicate with the 70 trillion cells in the body that you have enough energy, that you don't need to be eating carbohydrates all day long because you're in an energy deficit. And so that's a big piece of it. We're really setting the stage by engaging in those behaviors to improve insulin, blood glucose regulation. Our metabolic fire is much more robust in the first part of the day, specifically kind of between, the first morning hours, typically about 2 hours after, waking is what it shows. And then up to about 1 o'clock. And then we see this decline in that metabolic fire. And so we have a lot of people that are not eating until 12 or 1 o'clock. So they haven't signaled to leptin. And now the body is like, we don't really know how much energy is available. And that can, drive cravings and create all kinds of, blood sugar roller coasters over the course of the day as we grab carbohydrates, and then blood sugar rises, and then we get that massive fall. So there's lots of reasons why I do believe that it's wise to make sure that we're loading that food in the first part of the day. But then it is very well known that, the later that we eat in the day, the more dysregulated all of those hormones are going to become. And even when it comes to, Lucas, melatonin, we have about 5 hours to digest food, right? And so we have to have an empty stomach. We don't want to be digesting food because that's going to impact melatonin from being released. And so if you're eating, a lot of people will recommend 2 hours before bed, but then you're still digesting food for, the next 3 hours of sleep, where we could move that meal timing way up, have an empty stomach when we go to bed. And now we've just optimized all of that. So I really am a big supporter of eating early in the day and then cycling. So, if you want to do some fasting, if that's appropriate for where you are in your journey, it's, have lunch at 2 or 2:30 and then fast for the rest of the day until breakfast the next morning.
Something that came up when you were sort of discussing that was actually a product idea that I'd thought about over the last couple of years, and that is actually a way to stimulate endogenous melatonin production via the microbiome. I don't believe there's any specific like gut bacteria that have been, I'm not sure, maybe you know some, but maybe like looking at specifically gut bacteria that's able to increase endogenous melatonin production. So my idea there was like a gut to sleep product, like gut to sleep instead of get to sleep. That's sort of something I don't know if you've sort of explored that at all.
I haven't, but melatonin is made in the mitochondria as well, and we make melatonin through exposure to near infrared light. So again, this is where bringing in sunlight into the equation. It's the more sunlight, and we also make melatonin. Melatonin is really a morning hormone, right? Because it's our exposure to sunlight in the morning that is actually what makes serotonin, which gets converted to melatonin. And then that melatonin is going to get stored, or it's going to get stored in the pineal gland until we have 4 hours of darkness until that's released. And then throughout the day, we can have our mitochondria make melatonin as we expose our eyes and our skin to infrared light. And that melatonin, people really reduce melatonin down to, oh, we need it for a good sleep. And melatonin is our most potent antioxidant when it comes to protecting our mitochondria and keeping them healthy and young. And so we want to do everything in our power to really support optimizing melatonin production. And we can largely do that through light exposure. But I'm happy to look into the research around specific commensal bacteria that could be supported.
And so let's sort of go back to the butyrate discussion. Let's look at, like, from a consumer's perspective. They're obviously hearing about all of these, incredible research-backed benefits associated with sodium butyrate and its associated derivatives and things like that. But maybe do you want to sort of explore, Justine, practical applications, including like dosages, when people would want to use, when they can best benefit from butyrate. So sort of run us through maybe like typical dosage ranges to begin with.
Yeah, I think I'd be happy to. So I want to make sure that this is never, misconstrued as medical advice at all. But with butyrate, I do think it's really important for people to kind of watch for that therapeutic threshold, because there's many people now, because I've used butyrate for so long, maybe I'll backtrack a little bit. So when you look at a lot of these studies use 4 grams of supplemental butyrate. And so it's a pretty high dose. They're likely only using that short term, but that's going to be between 6 and 8 capsules of the BodyBio butyrate. There's about 1,300 milligrams of butyric acid in 2 capsules. And so there are some people that do really well with that more therapeutic dose. I always recommend dividing that into doses throughout the day. So I usually would recommend 2 sodium butyrate capsules after postprandial, after breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Or you could do 3 and 3 if you're only eating 2 meals. But I do think it's really important for people to watch for kind of that therapeutic benefit, that dose that really helps them to, constipation is alleviated. I didn't even talk about that. Butyrate is such a powerful tool for helping to support gut motility. And so sometimes it's 2 capsules and they get complete and total relief. And then you'll work with somebody else that takes 8 capsules. And that's what, gives them that relief. So I do think that you want to play with it a little bit because everyone's going to be slightly different. You can take sodium butyrate after meals. So if we think about, the theory going back to the fermentation of dietary fiber getting fermented, or dietary fiber getting fermented into these short chain fatty acids, then I think it would be appropriate to take them after a meal, because then we would be really stimulating, that's when our body would be making these short chain fatty acids. But there are many studies showing that sodium butyrate is really effective on an empty stomach as well. And specifically Lucas for sleep, because there is that connection between low levels of short chain fatty acids and sleep disturbances, insomnia. And so there are studies showing that taking sodium butyrate before bedtime can help to improve sleep quality. So I don't think it really matters when people take it. It's just when works best for them, and then finding that therapeutic dose.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think you've explained that really well, sort of breaking down like that there's definitely going to be just like what we see with a lot of supplements, is going to be that individuality in terms of the response. And then in terms of, perhaps, I don't know if you've seen this through blood test results with any patients, have you noted any particular change, like, actual objective data points that have changed on their blood test results, perhaps like C-reactive protein, maybe even lipid levels? I don't know if you've seen any of that at all.
That's tricky for me to answer because we're implementing lipid replacement therapy usually pretty much at the same time simultaneously. So we're throwing all cellular support hands on deck. But there are, many studies showing that liver is a really powerful tool to support non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I spoke about, that it preventing that translocation of LPS through the portal vein to the liver. And it has antioxidant properties and those anti-inflammatory properties. It's helping to support fatty acid synthesis. And so there's many reasons why you would want to use it for liver support for sure. It also, Lucas, I keep thinking of all these benefits. I could literally talk to you about butyrate for days, but it also induces glutathione production through the NRF2 pathway, and also through lowering inflammation and helping to support glutathione production and recycling of glutathione. So that's also going to, support liver health as well. So, and also speaking of, gut health in this, world that we live in with so many people that have mast cell activation syndrome, sodium butyrate is actually one of your most potent mast cell stabilizers as well. So really powerful tool for people that are having, all these reactions from food to stabilize those mast cells in the gut, because our gut, as you know, is really robust with those mast cells.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, from a histamine intolerance perspective, that's going to be, a really versatile nutrient, combined with obviously a lot of other antihistamine compounds like quercetin and some other, pretty awesome nutrients. I think there's, as we can tell, and again, like for those listening in, you can clearly see that butyrate has a wide variety of benefits outside of just gut health and improving the microbiome and, reducing leaky gut. What we're learning here, and thanks to your amazing explanations, Justine, is that, this is a pretty powerful compound that can support overall bodily function in so many different ways. And in terms of the future research, Justine, like what are you excited to see more of in terms of the future butyrate research? Like where's that sort of heading?
I'm really excited, and I didn't even mention this either. I'm really excited to see more studies come out around cardiovascular disease and how we can use butyrate to help to support cardiovascular outcomes. Because there are many studies now that are emerging, and I'm sure there's some that are very old that I missed, but that is really exciting. So both the brain and the heart, and as we know, those are kind of the two, reasons why the majority of the population dies. Outside of cancer, with neurodegenerative diseases or cardiovascular disease. And so anything that can support, preventing those disease processes from occurring is really exciting. So yeah, that's exciting. And sodium butyrate specifically, when it comes to cardiovascular disease, if anyone is interested in knowing this, that it's been shown to support removing plaque from the arteries. So, and phosphatidylcholine also has that same property. So using those together, I think could be a really, really great duo for helping to support individuals that have a high coronary calcium score and want to protect their valuable organ.
Phenomenal. Yeah, definitely. Well, I think it's pretty evident now that, and we're seeing thousands and probably even millions of people now, or thousands of people benefiting from butyrate supplementation. And I'd imagine the sodium form is probably the most popular one from BodyBio. That's the one I'll link in the podcast show notes, that sodium butyrate product. But yeah, I think this is you've done a really great job at sort of explaining the wide variety of benefits. You've explained the mechanism of action, extremely well. You've outlined pathways, and yeah, a lot of my audience is going to really appreciate this information so far. So just as a reminder for those listening in, if you do want to check out, butyrate, or consider it as an integration into your wellness regime, I will be leaving that linked in the podcast show notes down below if you do want to check that out. But otherwise, Justine, was there any other final words on butyrate?
No, I think we covered most things. I'm sure that I'll get off the call and think, oh shoot, I forgot to mention this. But right now, I think we covered things pretty thoroughly. And thanks for being such a great host.
Awesome. Yep. Thanks so much, Justine. And look forward to the next podcast. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Be sure to leave a 5-star review if you enjoyed this episode. And please be sure to share it around. And that's it from me today. I'll see you guys in the next podcast.